Thank you very much. Quick show of hands. How many of you have read the book, Exponential Organizations? Okay, a bunch of you. And how many of you have seen me speak before? Okay, a few of you. All right. So you know a bit about my background, I think. I'm actually Canadian from India originally. I spent 10 years in Europe restructuring large European organizations, many French companies, which is why I'm bold. And if you've interacted with French companies, that will make sense. And then my journey really starts with Yahoo, where I was the head of innovation 12 years ago and ran their incubator for a couple of years. And I learned a really fundamental lesson, which is what I'm now working on almost nonstop, which is when you attempt disruptive innovation in any large organization, the immune system attacks you. Because all of our organizations are built to resist change and withstand risk. And yet now, disruptive innovation and breakthroughs are the high order bit. And dealing with that juxtaposition is almost all of the work that I do now. I wrote the book as an answer to a question that we would get. We would run these one-week events at Singularity talking about the technology breakthroughs. And at the end of the week, we would get a question from the CEOs or investors or government leaders. And they would say, okay, I get the disruption. What the hell do I do on Monday when I get back to the office? And that was essentially the starting point for the book. Maybe the strangest phone call I've had in this last few years was last year from the Vatican. They called and said, look, the Pope has the oldest immune system in the world. As he's trying to update the Vatican, he has some really interesting tensions. And so we run some workshops there which will require some alcohol to discuss. So I'll leave that there. You heard from Kyla yesterday about Moore's Law. This is really the underlying fundamental disruption that's causing all of this. For 60 years, we've seen uninterrupted progress, and we expect that to just keep going. Because as each technology, whether it's vacuum tubes or transistors, kind of gets to the end of its life cycle, something else always takes over the curve. And so this is why this keeps going. It led Peter to write this book, Abundance, basically charting out that if we can actually harness this acceleration and leverage it, we'll soon have an abundance of healthcare, education, clean water, energy in about a decade. And what does the world look like if that's the case? Peter, of course, is the head of the X Prize Foundation, which gives large public prizes wherever there are market failures. I joined the board 18 months ago, some very interesting conversations we have at board level. Pretty much every board meeting now starts with, what did Elon just do? And then we move on to the rest of the business of the day. Something really amazing, though, happened a year ago. A few years ago, we announced this X Prize, which was, can you extract clean water out of the atmosphere, enough for a village or an apartment building, at less than 2 cents a liter, using only renewable energy? Right? So we put out this prize, and typically we think a prize will take about 7 or 8 years to run, and somebody will break through and finally find a solution. This is a dramatic breakthrough if you can get to this. Current state of technology was small 100-liter installations at about 50 cents a liter, so used for remote environments. And so we thought this would take 7 or 8 years to win the prize. And last year, a team popped up and said, we've done it. And we awarded the prize. So we now have the prototype of a machine that can extract clean water out of the atmosphere anywhere in the world for less than 2 cents a liter, which is kind of unbelievable. And if you have clean water, you take out half of all the diseases in the world. So the ripple effects go very, very quickly from there. And I use this just to highlight how dramatically the technology breakthroughs are moving, because we have a dozen technologies all moving on this doubling pattern in their way. And each technology's doubling, where they intersect, adds a whole other multiplier to the equation, right? And we talked already a little bit about how difficult this is. We have cognitively a very, very difficult time with this. All of our intuition, training, education about the world teaches us linear extrapolation, and we're really bad at spotting exponential growth. We've talked through some of the 6 Ds. I won't cover them heavily. I just want to touch on this framing analogy that I find really highlights how we think about this. The best metaphor that I've found of describing this is photography. And I don't mean the Kodak moment. I mean the transition from a physical substrate to an information-based environment. Many of you aren't old enough to actually remember film photography, but you're operating from a scarcity model. You can only carry so much film. It costs, what, €1 a photograph. It takes a few days to get your prints back. You move to the digital environment, and 3 fundamentally important things happen. First, marginal cost goes to 0. Right? That's pretty interesting. Now I can take 1,000 photographs and the cost doesn't change at all. As a result of that cost drop, the domain explodes. In film photography, I'm carefully clicking here or there. Today, we're holding the button down on all of our devices and taking literally billions of times more photographs because the cost is gone. Right? The third thing that happens is very subtle, but very, very important from a business perspective, is that you change the problem space. So in a scarcity problem environment, I have a whole bunch of business models that crop up around that scarcity, very expensive cameras. I may publish books on composition. I may teach courses on photography. You move to the digital environment and the problem space shifts. Nobody cares about those old models now. Now the problem we have is we all have 8 copies of our photographs on 10 devices and you can't find anything. Right? And that fundamental shift, more importantly, all the business models disappear. All the old scarcity business models disappear. Nobody can make money selling courses on photography today. Right? And what we're seeing as we move the world into an information-based environment, we're shifting onto that point, and then we totally change the underlying problem space. If I write in the book that the Tesla is not a car with computers and sensors in it, it's a computer with wheels. Right? And because it updates itself every few weeks, you have to think of it as an app that has wheels, which sounds ridiculous, but it's totally directionally on that path, right? And all of these technologies are going through this domain, and industry after industry is going through this type of a transition because these breakthroughs are happening. What it's resulting in is a massive, massive drop in the cost of technology, and something else is very unique today. One is that we have a dozen technologies all on this doubling pattern. The second is that in the history of humanity, advanced technologies always cost a lot, and only a government or a big private corporate lab could afford to do R&D, come up with new products and services, etc. But today that is actually not true. For the first time in human history, advanced technologies don't cost very much. Right? The cost of light dropping, gene sequencing we talked about already, solar energy dropping, the blockchain is open source and free. And this has never been seen before, and this is resulting in a complete explosion of innovation. I'll just touch on solar as one example of how dramatically and quickly this affects our world. Solar energy is on this doubling pattern, doubling every 22 months, and it's been doing it for 40 years. So for 40 years, we've been doubling the price performance of solar roughly every 2 years. At this pace, we will be able to deliver 100% of world energy supply with solar in 12 years. We are 6 doublings away from that point. Germany and some of the policies instituted here were responsible for 1 whole of those doublings. Here's the solar relative to the natural fossil fuel cost. You can see the unbelievable multiplier, and this graph is totally fascinating. Really important things about when you see a graph like this. One is that that doubling pattern doesn't stop. So if we can deliver 100% of our energy needs in 12 years, and it's doubling every 2 years, it means in 14 years we can deliver 200%, 16 years we can deliver 400%, in 18 years we can deliver 800%, and that just keeps going. So energy, which has been scarce for the entire history of humanity, is about to become abundant, which will completely, of course, change global geopolitics. Right? The Middle East collapses, the US has to find other reasons to go to war, et cetera, et cetera. And this is starting to happen now already. 1/4 of the farms in California are solar powered. Chile in South America today is generating so much solar energy, they're giving it to their neighbors for free. That's happening right now. And in the ultimate of all ironies I've been able to find, the Coal Museum in Kentucky is using solar panels. And how do you look in the mirror? I just don't know on this one. So very surreal types of things happening there. Now, the technologies are all kind of great. We can talk about that for a long time. And one way I frame it is that in the 15th century, we had the printing press, the Gutenberg moment, and that fundamentally changed society. We argue today that we have about 20 of these hitting us at the same time. Because just solar energy changes the world completely. Autonomous cars, drones, blockchain, biotech breakthroughs, etc. And as the enormous stress that we're seeing in the world is this is breaking all of our institutions. In fact, every mechanism that we use to run the world, our civics, our politics, our legal systems, our healthcare systems, intellectual property, education, all designed for a world a few hundred years ago. Right? And yet, we've all seen the immune system in our companies. If you try and update education, the teachers go crazy. You try and explain Bitcoin to a banker and he freaks out. They just cannot cope, right? Cannot deal with that paradigm shift. And so you get an institutional immune system response, and then policy gets held back, and we get into a political fight rather than dealing with this. And the underlying economics also pretty profound. The metabolism of the economy is increasing, but whenever we have a digital shift to a totally digital environment, you have an enormous deflationary cliff that hits. We saw a 6x drop in revenues in the newspaper business as eBay and Craigslist bid, a 10x drop in revenues in the music industry as we went from a scarcity physical media environment to a digital environment. And again, I mention again, it's really, really hard to spot this. When the Google car first appeared, the cost of the LiDAR, the GPS, the sensors, the radar was like $200,000 per car. And it went from 200 to 100 to 50 to 25 to 12 to 6 to 3. And now we're below $1,000 a car for all of these sensors. In 2012, the cost of this LiDAR unit at the top of this Prius was $75,000. Anybody know what it is today? Today, this is about $40. Why? Because there's 2 or 3 technologies in there. Each technology is dropping 50% a year. So the aggregate effect is absolutely profound. And I'll give you a little thought experiment. Go back to 2012 and go into a car company and tell them that this LiDAR unit will be basically free by the end of the decade, and watch the immune system response. You'll be given a white coat and some medicine, and you'll be asked to stand in the corner while everybody else does the important work. And so this is the pattern. And I just want to highlight this issue with this particular graph. What we found is when you have exponential growth, the experts in that industry absolutely cannot see it. They are not able to see it. And we've seen this in domain after domain after domain. What you see here in this chart is the actual growth of exponential growth of solar energy. Black, total hockey stick, classic exponential going up and to the right. What you see here in the colored lines is the predictions from the top energy experts in the world as to what will happen with solar. And what you see here is that every single point on the exponential, the experts go linear. Okay? So I've kind of blocked it out here. Here's 2015. That's what it looks like. Then we get to here. What do you think this looks like? We get to here. We get another linear prediction. Now we get to 2018. This guy thinks it goes down. Now, how do you get to this point blows my mind. And they never learn. For 20 years we've been watching this, and then not to just pick on the energy industry. This is in the car industry, the mobile phone industry, bandwidth predictions, network traffic predictions, etc. The experts in the domain go linear when you have an exponential curve. And all of our companies have experts that have been in that industry for 10, 20, 30 years. You try and show them this, and they'll go, no. They become very French. They go, pas possible. And you get stuck back in that discussion. And so how do you get across this? This is what I call the immune system problem. And the reason this is unstoppable is that as the cost of these technologies drops, anybody can innovate. And so you get this pattern happening where domain becomes digital, the costs go to zero, you get open source communities forming. Steve talked about the importance of that. And then you get to totally disruption of the status quo. The Hyperloop is a great example of this. No experience, Elon has no experience in the car sector, the energy sector, transportation sector, space sector, and he's created market leaders in all of them. By the way, his methodology is very simple. He takes a technology that's growing exponentially, rides it out 10 years. Where will it be on a doubling pattern in 10 years? And then build a company to intercept that curve in a 10-year period. That's how he operates. And to give you an example how if you can do this, I was chatting with him about the Hyperloop. He wants to go from LA to San Francisco in about 20 minutes. The original idea was to go at about 4,000 miles an hour. So I'm talking to him, and I said, Elon, I have a degree in physics. If you accelerate a human being from 0 to 4,000 miles an hour and then decelerate them back to 0 in 20 minutes, you're probably going to kill them. And his answer was, yeah, it's an issue. It's an issue, right? Now, in this example, I'm the expert, right? I'm going, wait a minute, you can't do that. What's important is I would have stopped. I would have stopped the project because I said, you don't want to kill people. And many of us would take on that attitude. He's like, yeah, it's a speed bump. We have to overcome that, etc. Now, I was half correct. You do have to slow down a little bit. But the mindset of just saying, well, we'll figure it out is the really key part. And now you have tens of thousands of entrepreneurs following this pattern, and they are not worried about experimenting. The costs are very low, and off they go. Vitalik Buterin, 18 years old, ignores his professors, and now we have Ethereum. So then the question becomes, if you're running a legacy environment, how do you deal with this? How do you actually adapt to this? So let me go kind of top down. Chris Anderson wrote this book a few years ago called Free, arguing that as we digitize and as you get to an information-based environment, every business model goes to free, and then you make money on a freemium model or a cross-subsidy model or an advertising model, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have the time, go read this book. But absolutely, definitely go read this blog post by Kevin Kelly, the founder of Wired Magazine. He wrote this blog post called Better Than Free. And he argues that if the base information is widely available, that there's 8 ways of adding value to it. And what he's identified here is really the business models of a digital age, right? Google gives you findability, Airbnb gives you accessibility, and so on. And so here he's identified how you can add value to what was traditionally a static environment, now an information-based environment, but we pay for immediacy on the stock market, for example. But this quote has been stuck in my head for quite a long time. David Rose, one of the godfathers of angel investing, writes this comment saying that if your organization is a top-down hierarchical pyramid command and control type structure, you are doomed to failure because that structure is designed for efficiency and for predictability. We want to deliver the same widget in 100 factories, deliver it to 50 countries, et cetera, et cetera. But our world today needs to be optimized for agility, flexibility, adaptability, and speed. And our old org structures simply don't deal with this. And this is where the Yahoo experience was fascinating to me. A company less than 10 years old could not innovate. Just couldn't do it. And I have a thesis as to why that we can get into. So I wrote this book, and what we realized was there's a completely new breed of organization emerging that we've never seen before. And we call these exponential organizations. The definition is you're delivering minimum 10 times better, faster, cheaper than your competitors and your colleagues in that same space. We're tracking an index of over 100 of these, and the book basically says that what is the model and then how do you do it. A good example is TED. Homage to Lara Stein there about creating TEDx. Chris Anderson takes it over. He does 3 things. He establishes a huge purpose, ideas worth spreading, gives all the TED Talks for free on YouTube, leveraging rich media. Then he allows anybody to go create a TEDx event, and now we have a global media brand. Right? From 0 to a global media brand in 10 years. Nobody's ever done that before. Here's another example. This car company is called Local Motors. These guys use a community of about 150,000 car designers, car enthusiasts to help them design the cars. If you're a typical car company, it costs about $3 billion to design a new car from scratch. They can do it for 1,000 times cheaper. A completely new car from scratch. Typical car has 25,000 parts, theirs has 50. A typical car takes about 1,000 man-hours to assemble, theirs takes 1. And a typical car factory is 1 million square feet, and theirs you could build in a garage. So here are 4 metrics on which they're blowing away the status quo by multiple orders of magnitude each. How the hell do you compete with that? You can't. You have 3 options if you're the legacy environment. Number 1, buy them, shut them down, right? Which is what was a favorite tactic in the energy industry. And that worked for a while, but now because of democratization, there's 5,000 solar companies, and the energy companies can't buy all 5,000. Option 2, lobby the government, legislate them out of existence, which is a favorite tactic in the US. That car can't possibly be safe, et cetera, et cetera. But that takes too long today, too expensive. Think about Uber's success. Uber is successful by deliberately breaking the law, leapfrogging the public acceptance, and waiting for policy to catch up. Right? Not a very pleasant process, but it's working for them. Option 3, of course, is what the hell are they doing, and can we reverse it into our legacy organizations? And that's the part that we look at. There's 3 pieces that go into building what we call exponential organizations. The first is most important. They all have what we call the MTP, or a massive transformative purpose. Google, organize the world's information. Singularity, go impact 1 billion people positively, et cetera, et cetera. We're now starting to see brands morph into this. Here's Coca-Cola's recent mantra, open happiness. In fact, 4 years ago, Paul Pullman read the book, and he was the CEO of Unilever. He ordered every brand in Unilever to take on an MTP and become much more purpose-driven and then more ecological and sustainable. And now the 5 most profitable brands in Unilever are the ones who adopted it the most. So that becomes like the North Star, as Simon Sinek talks about the why. Why do you exist? Then there's a set of 5 externalities that they use to keep a small feature footprint and use 1 or more of these to scale very quickly outside. Uber not hiring its own staff, TED using community, Airbnb leveraging other people's assets, and so on. And then there's 5 internal mechanisms that allow you to drive the internal control framework and manage culture, the whole lean startup methodology, decentralized organizations. We already heard about the importance of that to enable grassroots methodologies and so on. This is a great example. Hyar, top-down hierarchical pyramid-style company, 80,000 people. They were making 55 million fridges and ovens a year. And the CEO one day woke up and decided, I can't meet my corporate goals this way. And he blew it up, turned 80,000 people into 2,000 autonomous teams of about 40 people each. Each team has a P&L, each team elects their own leader, each team decides whatever they want to do. Now, I'll give you a little challenge. Go to any business school in the world and say, I want to make 55 million fridges a year, and they'll tell you need a ton of centralized product strategy, demand forecasting, inventory management, supply chain management, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out you don't. Who knew? And the way they do it is if they want to decide what features should go into the new fridge, the 2,000 teams vote. And that wisdom of crowds gives them a much better outcome than some centralized product strategy team trying to understand market research and focus groups. Here's another company that is building an entire Hyperloop system, crowdsourcing the entire design. They have no employees. They have 800 engineers around the world working on this for little bits of equity for each one. And now what we found is if you're doing a startup, you should be using all of these. Because if you're not, somebody else is. If you're a big company, if you fully implement 4 of them, you get a 10x performance improvement in your organization. The poster child of this is, from a startup perspective, is GitHub. How many of you are familiar with GitHub? Hopefully a bunch of you, great. So software platform that allows developers to collaborate, because we know the peer-to-peer collaboration in software development yields much better code. They use all 11 characteristics. Microsoft just bought this company for $7.5 billion. And I just want to stress something here. This company has no assets, no workforce, no intellectual property. That's what's possible. If you're not doing one of these, what the hell are you doing? Because this is what's possible today. This is how much value you can create from a totally environment. So then the question becomes, how do you deal with this if you're an existing legacy organization? And for me, this was the hard intellectual challenge. So it's great to kind of identify that startups operate in this way. For me, the hard part was, how do you retrofit this? Because we have, every one of our global 5,000 needs to navigate this. And there's a bunch of suggestions. I'll just touch on 2. Number 1, obviously, update your leadership. If your C-suite and your board don't have a good sense of what the world is changing, take BMW. The tagline is, we're the ultimate driving machine. And we're pretty clear we're going to a driverless world over time. So that's a pretty big tension to navigate if you're BMW, right? But most importantly is this one, do not do disruptive innovation in the core organization. The immune system will attack you, you'll get into a political fight, and nobody has any fun in this environment. Our strong suggestion is take your crazy people to the edge of the organization and build into adjacent spaces, build EXOs into adjacent spaces. Larry Page came to me a few years ago and said, hey, your unit at Yahoo is successful. Should I do that at Google? I said, no, you'll have this immune system problem. Do something like it, keep it stealth, point it away from the core business of the core company. And you see the result in Google X, where they have their core information management capability, and they had hardware, Google Glass, Google Car, contact lenses to go into adjacent spaces. The master of this technique is actually Apple. And yes, they have a great design capability and a great supply chain. I would argue that Apple's real innovation is organizational. Because what they do, unlike anybody else in the world, is they will form a small team that's very disruptive. They will take that team to the edge of the organization. They will keep them completely secret and stealth, and they will say to them, go disrupt another industry. Right? Nobody does this. Nobody's even noticed that this is what they're doing. So they have a portfolio of teams looking at different industries. When they think something is ready for disruption, they go into it with the Apple Watch or the car or whatever, retail, payments, et cetera, et cetera. There's no limit to their market cap. They can just keep running this model. And if you're a legacy environment, this is the model to aspire to. A bunch of war stories here. One success one is Nestle for years tried to run Nespresso as a line of business, failed. Finally, they put it as a separate entity. Boom, it's a $6 billion line of business because you free it from the constraints of the mothership. Walmart is a really great example of a failure mode. They realized 10, 12 years ago that they had to compete with Amazon, that this whole e-commerce thing was not a fad. So they set up a team in Bentonville and said to the team, okay, we have the best logistics, inventory management, supply chain in the world, go beat Amazon. Within 18 months, the immune system had killed it. Because all the existing executives said, we should be optimizing for our own stores, what are these guys doing, et cetera, et cetera. So they did it a second time, and they put the team at the edge of the organization, but still said, in typical corporate fashion, still use our existing capability, we have the best in the world, let's leverage that. 18 months later, that was dead. So they did it a third time. And they made a very courageous decision on the third time. They said, go to the edge, go build your own independent supply chain distribution, even though we have the best in the world, because we have to figure this out. It started to succeed. The business got excited, pulled it back in, and killed it. And it was on the fourth iteration, they did it separately, independently, and only after it achieved critical mass did they start stitching the back ends together. But in that intervening 8 years, Amazon is gone. Right? And now you're a B player at best. And so it's really fascinating. And these are smart people. The lesson I take from this is that it's just really hard. In our history of our business world, we've never had to deal with this, and now we do. What we recommend is you take your current organization, reshape a bit so you can spin off these EXOs at the edge, and over time, the EXO should become bigger than the current organization and becomes a new gravity center. In fact, Marriott, if it had spun off, TripAdvisor, Booking.com, Airbnb would have a market cap of more than 4 times the current market cap. And what's really interesting is all of these ideas were inside Marriott and couldn't see the light of day. Why? Because the immune system would kill it. Because they would cannibalize the existing business. The executives would say that shouldn't be our focus, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you enable that? How do you enable the actual spin-off of these new ideas? In fact, there's a great case study of Lojas Americanas. This is the largest retailer in Brazil, spun off an e-commerce unit and had the courage to leave it alone separately, independently. And as of 8 months ago, the e-commerce unit is now generating more revenues than the mothership. So we now have a precedent for this. What we've been working on, which we're super excited about, which what you see in this book on your tables, is we have solved that immune system problem. So we created a 10-week process that we ran with Procter & Gamble 4 years ago. And the aim was, can we run a 10-week process inside your company that will hack culture at scale, solve that immune system problem? And the measurement was, can we move your leadership, culture, management thinking 3 years ahead in 10 weeks? So we ran it with P&G, and it worked really well. Even then, I thought, okay, maybe we got lucky. P&G's pretty advanced, et cetera, et cetera. We did it a second time with the largest insurance company in Mexico, backwards regulated, family-owned, worked even better. And so we have an advisory company that's done this. What we've done with this methodology is open sourced it in the book. So the book you have is essentially a manual on how to run that process, because every one of the Global 5,000 has to go through that process with or without us, because the opportunity cost of not doing this is near infinite today. And so we've done it a whole bunch of times, as I said, with blue chip companies. Procter & Gamble has said they've gotten almost $1 billion of benefit that they would not have received if they hadn't done it. The insurance company has doubled revenues and tripled profits in 3 years since doing this. So this is not joking around. In fact, when the earthquake hit Mexico, they galvanized the teams that worked on the sprint, and they launched a new insurance product in 72 hours. This is an insurance company we're talking about, right? And so think about the metabolism that increases there. In fact, Jack Welch, the CEO of GE, said in his annual report in the year 2000, the minute your metabolism of your company is slower than the outside world, you're dead. The only question is when. And I would argue today that the metabolism of most big companies is slower than the outside world. And this process seems to increase that metabolism, so we've open sourced it. We didn't stop there. We said, okay, that's great. We've solved that problem in the private sector. But really to transform civilization, which is what is our MTP, how do you solve the planet? We have to do this at scale in our existing institutions. education, journalism, monetary systems, justice systems, all of these are stuck behind old thinking. So we created a nonprofit, adapted the process. It takes 16 weeks because it's public sector, but it works. We've run it now 4 times in Medellin. We ran it with the mayor of Miami 2 years ago on public transportation. We just finished with the president of Colombia and the Supreme Court to transform the justice system in Colombia. And so we figured out a way of doing this. And we're now building a global community, which is now about 2,000 people. I invite you to come and join. It's openexo.com, which is very close collaboration with Boma in how we do things. We actually now do trainings to certify people in this model. If you're interested, we'll share these slides with you. We do 4-week certification programs to train people in this methodology to apply this to their world. So just to highlight that we think we've cracked an interesting problem, which is the solving of the immune system, which is a structural issue that we don't think has ever been solved at scale before. And we've been able to apply it both in the private sector, but now more importantly in the public sector. And we're going for it. We're going for like a transformation of the planet on this one. So that's us. Stefan, back to you. Thank you very much for having me.
So we have a lot of questions. Thank you, Salim, for coming. So let's pick up the questions. First questions. How can I grow? Let's take the first one. Yeah. How can I grow exponentially if my manager says, stop having so many ideas and just do your job? Leave the corporate and found my own startup?
Yeah, go find your own startup. So the minute you have a manager that says that, you have the wrong manager. And so leave. Right? In fact, one of the reasons the sprint works, the way it works, we do an opening session with all the senior management and run a half-day Singularity-style shock and awe session and freak them out. And then we take 25 young leaders, future lieutenants that do the work. It's a coaching model. And they come up with the ideas. And what we found is that group of 25 will totally champion their ideas. And if senior management says we don't like these ideas, they leave. Now they have a massive retention problem. They go, okay, just let them go do those silly ideas. And then it works. And so that's part of the reason it works. But if your manager says stop having so many ideas, you have the wrong manager. So that's simple.
Next question. How do you integrate the people of a current organization into the EXO?
Yeah, you don't. You can't. If you have legacy thinking people, they're optimized for doing the legacy thinking. They will not fit into this new model. We emphasize trying to go as many new people as possible into the EXO. So the idea is you keep the legacy, you set up a new EXO on the edge. You only bring people in from the legacy that if you absolutely have to have integration and communication with the mothership, then you bring them over people that can help navigate that. But ideally, it's a completely new team because the skill set needed to build an EXO is completely different from the skill set in the legacy. And the more experience you have in the legacy, the worse you will be at that EXO, right? Just by definition. And really importantly, and Elon Musk has proved this, that experience today is actually a massive barrier to innovation because you'll keep going back. And I want to tell a really quick story. So we built Singularity, very successful, et cetera. 3-4 years ago, they did an offsite board meeting. And Peter said, would you come to the board meeting and join this offsite? So I said, sure. And I posed an interesting question. I said, look, we're almost 10 years old. If we went back to 10 years ago and had to recreate Singularity today, the way we did 10 years ago, we would do it very differently, and we should think about that. How would we recreate it? Because when we launched it, Facebook wasn't that big of a deal. We didn't have e-learning platforms. Social media was not prevalent. So the board said, that's interesting. Go think about that and come back with a thought of, if you were going to recreate Singularity today, what would it look like? And I went off and I tried 4 separate times to do this exercise, and I couldn't do it. Because our model had been successful, my mind kept going back to the model that got created, which is totally the wrong answer. And we're only 8 years old at the time, right? And that's how hard it is. So what we did was we put a team together of some annoyed alumni and some faculty that came in very occasionally, put them together, and they came up with a concept that was very different from what I would have come up with. So you can't do it yourself, let alone trust other people to do it.
This is just very close, but it's the gong that
I love the
last
chime
questions. Last questions.
Okay.
Let's go for the next one from Anne. Are migrants more likely to bring breakthrough innovation? If so, how can we nurture that potential?
Yeah, by definition, migrants. every single person in Silicon Valley has come from somewhere else. Every single person in Silicon Valley has come from somewhere else. And the reason it's successful is in most parts of the world, if you stand up and say, I'm going to change the world, the rest of society will pull you back down. They'll say, who are you to do this? Whereas in Silicon Valley, people don't say, are you crazy? They know you're crazy. The question is, how do you plan on doing that? And they're open to that. So the concept of immigration is key. Steve Blank, who's one of the founders of the lean startup movement, made this comment that entrepreneurs almost always go somewhere else to do their work. They're by definition immigrants. They've taken on the personal risk of moving into a separate, changing context, etc. And of course, you get the diversity of thought and different experience sets, etc.
All right, next question. How do we encourage consumers to purchase today if products will be exponentially better and cheaper next year?
That's a marketing problem, and that's past my pay grade. So I'm going to beg to step out of that. I don't know how you deal with that one. Okay.
Okay, next question. Alan, what do you think of failures of like sharing bicycles over in China, and most recently the huge devaluation of a company like WeWork?
Ooh, good one. Okay, so I was just at the SoftBank Vision Conference, Vision Fund Conference last week with all the CEOs of all the portfolio companies. The CEO of WeWork was conspicuously absent from that conference. And then 3 days later, he resigns. I think WeWork is going to end up like a Theranos. It turns out there's quite a lot of fraud in the model, and they made some radical assumptions that turned out to be not true, and some fairly dodgy practices. But I think the other concept of the bicycles and so on is a really important point. We saw in the first phase of the internet lock-in from the supply side and the demand side, where Amazon or Google or an eBay could lock in and use network effects and create a moat around them and prevent innovation in that space. And we're wondering what would happen as we get to the next wave. What we're very encouraged by is that we're not seeing that in this next wave. The minute you go into the physical world, you can't lock in the supply side. Every Uber driver in the US is also a Lyft driver, right? The minute you allow one scooter company, there's 50, as Carlos showed us, right? So it becomes a commodity very, very quickly on the supply side. Maybe there's a really important point to be made on what is the economic thesis for this new organization that's very important. When you're running a business, you worry about demand and supply. Very specifically, cost of demand, cost of supply, right? Hopefully you're on the right side of that equation. The internet, for the first time in the history of business, allowed us to drop the cost of demand exponentially. Online marketing, referral marketing, every Silicon Valley company is trying to go for a viral loop, which drops your customer acquisition costs to zero or near zero. So that's great. And we saw this initial boom of the Facebook, Googles, et cetera, riding that wave. What exponential organizations have figured out is how do you drop the cost of supply exponentially, right? You think about Airbnb, the marginal cost of adding a room to their inventory is almost zero. If you're Hyatt, you have to build a hotel. And now we have market entrants in many, many industries coming in with very low marginal cost of supply. That's an existential threat for the incumbents, and you can't compete with that.
All right, last question. Compare revenue and earnings of Walmart and Amazon, and looking at how many people are employed. New evaluation standards could find Walmart the winner. What is your thought on that?
I think the employment side becomes less relevant because we don't need to employ people, and I'm a huge fan of what is called a universal basic income, and I think we'll end up in that spot. I just don't see how Walmart beats Amazon. I think it's going to be a totally new entrant. We're starting to see Shopify now compete with Amazon successfully. I think Walmart has too much legacy in it to really do it properly unless they spun off something totally differently.
Okay. All right. Salim, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.
You stay on, right?
I'll stay here for a bit.